Hello everyone, my name is Jacob Harris, and today my presentation topic that I'll be discussing with you is on Parkinson's disease. So just to give everyone a little more information and background on Parkinson's, it is a progressive nervous system disease that affects mainly motor control, and it can affect a few other aspects in people as well, but it mainly affects motor control. And those signs and symptoms that are affected is bradykinesia, which is just slow movements, tremors in the fingers and hands, rigid muscles, as well as posture control issues and balance issues, and loss of automatic movements such as blinking, swallowing, chewing, and smiling. With those motor control issues come non-motor control symptoms as well, which can be depression, anxiety, constipation, sleep apnea, obesity, stress and anxiety, and even dementia. One of the main issues with Parkinson's, and I'll cover this a little bit later in this presentation, is it's super hard to identify early on. And that's because the symptoms are really mild and sometimes they go unnoticed. And you don't really start showing those motor control issues until later on in the disease's cycle. But one major way that they can diagnose you with having Parkinson's is that Parkinson's, when those motor control issues start, it's a unilateral disease. So those motor control issues will start in one side of the body before they get worse in the other, before it becomes bilateral. And the Center for Disease Control rated Parkinson's disease to be the 14th cause of death in the US. Just some more statistics to give you guys an idea of Parkinson's. In 2020, 1 million Americans will be diagnosed with Parkinson's, and that's more than multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy, and Lou Gehrig's disease combined. And each year on top of that, 60,000 more Americans will be diagnosed with it as well. Parkinson's is usually associated with the older demographic, and that shows here in the statistics because only 4% of diagnosed cases will be diagnosable before the age of 50. The rest of the 96% is 50 and older, and that increases as you age, the percentage. Men are 1.5 times more likely to be diagnosed with Parkinson's than women, and the cost of Parkinson's disease in the US alone is upwards of $65 billion a year. And that's because the medication for one patient to take it for a yearly is $2,500. And the surgery, which is not always effective, can be upwards of $100,000 a year as well. And in the general world, 10 million people are diagnosed with Parkinson's. So now we get some general background information about it. Let's get more specific and talk about the histology of Parkinson's. As I stated earlier, Parkinson's disease is a neurodegenerative disorder, but more specifically, it affects the dopaminergic neurons in the brain. So dopaminergic neurons just means neurons in the brain that forms dopamine. Dopamine is used in movement and muscle flexion and extension, anything that involves movement in the body. And those dopaminergic neurons are located more specifically in the brain, in the midbrain, and at a place called the substantia nigra. So I just want to cover this illustration right here. This is a transmitting neuron. This is coming down from the brain, and it transmits dopamine, as you can see in the synaptic cleft, which is this little white area right here. There's a bunch of dopamine cells in a healthy patient that go across the receptor cell and then get transported or used in movement or whatever the dopamine is used for in that particular receptor cell. But in this Parkinson's disease patient, you can see in this synaptic cleft, there's very few dopamine cells at all. And that's because when the degradation of the dopaminergic neurons starts happening, once they start disappearing, there's no way to get them back. And once a Parkinson's disease patient is diagnosable with Parkinson's disease, those neurons, they've lost a majority of them. So here's just another illustration to pinpoint where that substantia nigra is. And it's right here. This is the midbrain, and this lit up area. In a healthy patient, it shows that it's super active. And that's because the substantia nigra is producing all those that dopamine that's used in movement. And as you can see in the Parkinson's disease, before symptoms even start showing, you can already see a substantial part of that isn't active anymore. I would say probably half of it isn't active anymore. And then once the Parkinson's disease patient starts showing some symptoms, you can see that there's 10%, maybe 15% of the original activity there versus a healthy patient. So what causes Parkinson's disease? And this is another issue with Parkinson's is we don't really know what causes it. studies are still being done today to determine what actually causes it. In studies before, you see that Parkinson's can run in some families, but it's super rare to be passed through genes, so that's kind of inconclusive. The scientists have kind of deemed that inconclusive. Scientists are looking more at environmental factors and researching more if environmental factors is what can cause it. And they're specifically looking at what pesticides and herbicides in farming, like on fruits and vegetables, what they're using and if it can affect that, or environmental pollution such as, pollution from cars, natural gases, coal, oil, any of that. But there's no single pinpoint thing that can cause Parkinson's. So I say a little bit earlier in the first slide that Parkinson's is super hard to identify early on. And if we take a look at this graph, I think this graph is super interesting, and it does a really good job to explain why. As you can see, Parkinson's is it says here it's a 40-year disease. And this 20-year prodrome just means before you start showing the symptoms of Parkinson's. And you can see here these symptoms 20 years before the clinical onset of the tremors and rigidityness. You have constipation, bladder control disorder, sleep disorder, obesity, depression. These are still symptoms that are associated with Parkinson's, but it's 20 years before you get those motor control issues, which is why it's so hard to diagnose people with it. Another reason it's hard to diagnose people with Parkinson's is there's not one conclusive test that can confirm that you have Parkinson's. The best way that you can confirm it is by going to a neurologist, and all they can really do is look at your medical history and perform neurological and physical exams and just review your signs and symptoms. And they can also do blood draws and a dopamine transport scan, which just shows how much dopamine is in your body, but even those can be inconclusive sometimes. And MRI and CT scans can only rule out other diseases. They aren't really helpful with diagnosing you with Parkinson's disease. So we know that there's no cure for Parkinson's and its effects are irreversible, but how can you treat it? There are two ways. One way is way more common, and the other way is the surgery. So the surgery is kind of inconclusive sometimes, and it's not really a popular way. It's also super expensive. But the other way is medication, and that specific medication is called carbidopa-levodopa. And it's really, really effective early on in Parkinson's, like the cycle of the disease of Parkinson's. But after longer use, it worsens and it's less effective. So once Parkinson's disease starts worsening and you get those motor control issues, carbidopa-levodopa has less of an effect, and sometimes it has no effect depending on what timeline you're at. And the way that carbidopa-levodopa works is it's a natural chemical that you take orally that then passes into your brain and is converted to dopamine. So it doesn't replace those neurons, it just replaces the dopamine that isn't being made anymore. And some side effects are associated with this medicine is nausea, lightheadedness, and dyskinesia. So how does exercise fit in with Parkinson's disease? And it's actually super interesting because exercise is a huge part of the treatment as well. And it works in two ways. There's symptom management and slow progression. So the symptom management is more with the motor control side, and it helps with, exercise can help with reduce stiffness, it improves the mobility, flexibility, posture, it can help with balancing gait, but it can actually also help with depression, anxiety, stress, sleep disorder, obesity. It also helps maintain neurotransmitters to vital organs and keeps the nervous system healthy. So that's the symptom management side of it. What does the slow progression side mean? Slow progression just means, as we saw on that graph, 20 years after clinical onset is when you get towards the dementia and bedridden and all of those aspects. So exercise can even make that 20 years longer. But the most important part of exercise is, because every case-to-case Parkinson's disease patient is going to be different, but the best way exercise can be used is just to be consistent with it. So the case study that I decided to do was in a patient who is 57 years old, and his name is Mr. Cunningham, and he has early onset motor issues with Parkinson's. His blood pressure is 156/89, and he is sedentary at the moment. He is currently provided and prescribed carbidopa-levodopa, and he has a BMI of 23%. and then I get his blood glucose, his total cholesterol, his LDL and HDL, which is all in check and it's good. When I talked with him about what his goals were, he wanted to gain back his trust and his balance, as well as improve his flexibility and body composition. So what that means is he's already suffering from balance issues. He already has rigid muscles, and he has obesity, or he's not technically obese, but he wants to work on his body composition so that doesn't happen later. So before we give him an exercise prescription, we need to talk about his exercise testing. And there's 2 tests that I wanted to perform with him. The first is a treadmill test, and that's just to monitor his blood pressure and heart rate during exercise, because I wasn't sure how carbidopa-levodopa would react with exercise, or how he would, because he's sedentary. And the second test would be the 6-inch step-up test for 2 minutes, and that's completing a full step up and step down every 2 seconds. So this test was done to monitor his flexibility and balance, because he said those are his main issues. So after completing the treadmill test, he finished with a blood pressure of 165/83 and a heart rate of 156 beats per minute at 50% intensity. And the steps test showed that he did have flexibility and balance issues, as he was not able to keep up with the pace of the test restrictions. So my prescription for Mr. Cunningham would be for him to complete 30 minutes of aerobic exercise every day. So my suggestions would be to walk outdoors, use a railing, walking around a track. Water activities is super good for him, because you don't have to worry about your balance in water, and you can use weights underwater, and those will all be at 50% intensity, and that would be 5 days a week. On top of that, I also wanted him to work on his flexibility and balance, and this would be 3 times a week, and these can be anything from Tai Chi to yoga to just even stretching, because we want to loosen up that muscle rigidness. And for his body composition work, aerobic helps with that, but resistance training can work with that as well. I don't want to throw too much with him with resistance training, so I only do 2 and 3 times a week at 50% intensity with 3 sets of 10 to 12 reps. And those exercises will be anything from bicep curls to, I don't want him doing squats because of his balance issues, and we'll talk about that a little later in the modifications, but any weight training exercises that he can perform, I would like him to do. So speaking of modifications, what are some modifications that he can do with aerobic exercise? If he's walking outside, I recommend him to use a cane, or like I said before, railing around a track or some kind of support. He could even hold on to the wall if he's using a stair test to work on his flexibility and balance. He'd perform that in his home. And then sometimes Parkinson's day-to-day could be worse than the day before. If he's feeling particularly unbalanced, he could use a cycle or use an arm cycle to work on his aerobic exercise. For flexibility, he could, if he's standing and stretching, he could hold onto a wall and stretch, or he'd use partner-assisted stretching, or we can even start with static stretches in the beginning of this entire exercise prescription and build up to dynamic. And then for resistance training, like I stated before, you would want to use almost all body weight or very little to light weight, because you don't want him to overwork himself. So in conclusion, there isn't a lot known about Parkinson's, and that's one of the main reasons I wanted to discuss it and cover this in the topic. And I wanted to show that just because you're diagnosed with Parkinson's, you can still function and meet your needs before the end of the disease's cycle. And when I was researching this, a lot of the people that have Parkinson's disease describe Parkinson's as a journey, because the disease is so long, and it all dependent on how you decide to take the journey. And that's what affects you the most. So if you decide to be proactive and use exercise and take your medication, your journey will be a lot more smooth than someone who decides not to. And that's everything. Those are my references. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate you guys taking the time to listen. Thank you.